On a routine flight from Atlanta to Chicago, the man in charge of 180 souls, Captain Richard Wallace, held all the power. He was the commander, the authority, the law at 35,000 feet. But what happens when that absolute authority is twisted by ego and prejudice? When a simple request from a passenger, a respected heart surgeon named Dr. Matteo Bennett, spirals into a terrifying threat of arrest and federal intervention. This isn't just a story about an argument on an airplane. It's a story about the abuse of power, a silent recording that would change everything, and the long, hard fall that comes when Homeland Security uncovers the truth and karma comes to collect its debt with interest. The air inside the cabin of Summit Air Flight 2127 was a familiar blend of recycled chill and the faint, sweet scent of disinfecting wipes. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of unremarkable day that fills the schedules of frequent flyers. Dr. Matteo Bennett, a cardiologist with a reputation for steady hands and a calmer demeanor, was one such flyer. He was heading home to Chicago after a successful consultation at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. All he wanted was to review his notes, perhaps get a precious 30 minutes of sleep, and be home in time to have dinner with his wife and daughter. His boarding pass read 22B, a middle seat. Dr. Bennett, a tall man with a quietly imposing frame, disliked middle seats with a passion, but he was too late booking to get an aisle. As boarding continued, he noticed an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, struggling to get her carry-on into the overhead bin above her seat 3A. A young man in a college sweatshirt helped her, and she settled into the aisle seat with a grateful sigh. Just before the cabin door was sealed, Dr. Bennett saw his chance. The window seat next to the woman 3C was empty. A quick check of the airline app confirmed it was the last unsold seat on the flight. An idea sparked. A tight connection at O'Hare meant getting off the plane sooner would be a significant advantage. He approached the lead flight attendant, a woman with professionally styled blonde hair and a name tag that read Clara. "Excuse me," Matteo said with a polite smile. "I see that seat 3C is empty. My seat is 22B. Would it be possible for me to move up there? It would help me make a tight connection in Chicago." Clara offered a tight plastic smile. "Sir, we need to wait until we've reached cruising altitude to facilitate any seat changes, for weight and balance." "Of course, I understand completely," Matteo replied, returning to his middle seat. He was a man of science and rules. He respected protocol. The plane took off smoothly, piercing through the thick Georgia humidity into the clear blue expanse above. As the seatbelt sign pinged off, Matteo waited patiently. Clara walked past his row twice, studiously avoiding his gaze. Finally, on her third pass, he caught her eye. "Ma'am, about that seat," he asked, his voice still gentle. She sighed a small put-upon sound. "Fine, go ahead." Matteo gathered his briefcase and made his way to the front. He smiled at the elderly woman in 3A. "Hello, I hope you don't mind if I take the window seat." "Not at all, dear," she said warmly. "More the merrier." He settled in, enjoying the simple luxury of the extra space and the view of the cloudscape. He was just opening his laptop when a different flight attendant, a younger woman named Chloe, approached him. Her expression was apologetic. "Sir, I'm so sorry," she began, her voice a near whisper. "Clara shouldn't have told you that you could move. Our flight is technically full even with the no-show. Company policy is that no one can change seats on a full flight, even if there's an empty one. My Lady Clara is insisting I ask you to move back to your assigned seat." Matteo felt a flash of irritation, but it was fleeting. It was a silly rule, but it was a rule. Arguing would only create a scene and delay the beverage service. "No problem at all," he said, already starting to close his laptop. "I understand. Thank you for letting me know so politely." He gave Chloe a reassuring smile, and she looked visibly relieved. He stood up, ready to make the short walk of shame back to 22B. But before he could take a step, Clara was there, her face a thunderous mask. Behind her, emerging from the cockpit, was Captain Richard "Rick" Wallace. Captain Wallace was a man who wore his authority like his perfectly pressed uniform. He was in his late 50s, with a stern, weathered face and sharp blue eyes that seemed to be permanently narrowed in judgment. He wasn't just the pilot, he was the commander of this small aluminum kingdom, and his posture broadcasted it. "Is there a problem here?" Wallace's voice boomed, cutting through the cabin hum. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "No, Captain, not at all," Matteo said calmly, gesturing back towards his original seat. "There was a misunderstanding about the seat. I was just heading back." Wallace ignored him, his glare fixed on Matteo as if he were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. He turned to Clara. "What's the issue?" "This passenger refused to stay in his assigned seat. Captain Ward." Clara said, her voice now filled with a theatrical strain of distress. "He moved up here without permission and was being disruptive when we asked him to return." A lie. A brazen, unnecessary lie. Matteo's calm began to fracture. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers turning towards him. The color of his skin, the fact that he was a large black man in a premium section of the plane where he hadn't been assigned, suddenly felt like a piece of evidence being presented against him. "That's not true," Matteo said, his voice firm but even. "I was given permission, and when I was told it was a mistake, I immediately agreed to move back. There was no disruption." Captain Wallace took a step closer, invading Matteo's personal space. The smell of stale coffee was sharp on his breath. "I'm the captain of this aircraft. My crew's word is final. When a member of my crew gives you an instruction, you follow it instantly. You don't argue. You don't negotiate. You comply. Do you understand me?" The condescension was thick, dripping with an unearned superiority that set Matteo's teeth on edge. He was a cardiac surgeon. He held lives in his hands daily and dealt with immense pressure with grace and precision. He was not a child to be scolded. "I understood the instruction perfectly," Matteo stated, his voice dropping to a low, controlled tenor. "And I was complying. Your flight attendant is misrepresenting the situation." The captain's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "Are you calling my flight attendant a liar?" he barked. Passengers were now openly staring, some holding up their phones. "I am stating the facts of what occurred," Matteo said. "There's no need to escalate this. I am returning to my seat." He tried to step past the pilot, but Wallace blocked his path. "No, you're not going anywhere. You have created a disturbance. You have challenged the authority of my crew. That makes you a security risk." The phrase hung in the air, charged and venomous. Security risk. It was a weaponized term, one that carried immense weight in a post-9/11 world, and it was being aimed directly at him. Matteo stared at the pilot, his heart, the organ he knew so intimately, beginning to pound with a righteous, furious anger he rarely allowed himself to feel. A security risk for a misunderstanding about a seat that I was already resolving, Captain. That is a serious and baseless accusation. Wallace smirked, a cruel, triumphant curl of his lip. "It's my cockpit, my call, and I'm making it. Sit back down in that seat." He pointed to 3C. "And don't say another word. We'll deal with you when we land." The captain turned and disappeared back into the cockpit. Clara shot Matteo a look of pure, venomous victory before bustling off. The younger flight attendant, Chloe, looked at Matteo with wide, horrified eyes before quickly busying herself at the galley. Dr. Matteo Bennett, a man of healing and precision, sat down in seat 3C. He was no longer a respected surgeon or a husband and father. In the eyes of Captain Richard Wallace, he was a problem, a threat. And as the plane droned on towards Chicago, Matteo had a chilling premonition that the confrontation was far from over. He quietly took out his phone, placed it on his lap, and started a discreet audio recording. He had a feeling he was going to need it. The remainder of the flight was thick with a palpable tension. The beverage service was conducted in near silence, with flight attendants Clara and Chloe moving through the cabin with a forced, brittle cheerfulness. Clara refused to make eye contact with Matteo, while Chloe would occasionally cast a worried, apologetic glance his way. The other passengers in the forward cabin pretended to be engrossed in their books and screens, but Matteo could feel their surreptitious glances. He had been branded, tried and convicted in the court of Captain Wallace's ego. Matteo didn't touch his laptop. He didn't sleep. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his mind a whirlwind. He replayed the encounter, dissecting every word, every nuance, the captain's immediate aggression, Clara's inexplicable lie, the loaded term, security risk. It was a textbook case of racial profiling, escalated by a man drunk on his own minor authority. The audio on his phone continued to record the ambient cabin noise, a silent digital witness. As the plane began its descent into the sprawling grid of Chicago, the captain's voice came over the intercom. It was the standard, cheerful pre-landing announcement, thanking them for flying Summit Air. There was no hint of the venom he had displayed earlier. To anyone who hadn't witnessed the confrontation, he was just another pilot doing his job. The hypocrisy was galling. The moment the plane docked at Gate C-17 at O'Hare International Airport and the seatbelt sign was extinguished, an announcement crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please remain in your seats. I repeat, all passengers, please remain seated until instructed otherwise." A murmur of confusion and annoyance rippled through the cabin. Matteo knew exactly what it was for. His heart rate quickened, not with fear, but with a cold, determined resolve. He watched as 2 uniformed Chicago Police Department officers and 2 airport security guards walked down the jet bridge and stopped at the aircraft's open door. They spoke briefly with Clara, who pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Matteo in seat 3C. Captain Wallace emerged from the cockpit, his face set like granite. He strode over to Matteo's row. The elderly woman in 3A shrank back in her seat, her eyes wide with alarm. "Dr. Bennett," Wallace said, mispronouncing his name with deliberate contempt. "On your feet. You're coming with me." Matteo remained seated. He looked past Wallace to the police officers at the door. "Officers," he said, his voice ringing with clarity in the silent cabin. "May I ask what this is about?" One of the CPD officers, a stocky man named Miller, stepped into the cabin. "So the captain has reported a disturbance, a security threat. We need you to deplane for questioning." "I am not a security threat," Matteo said, his voice unwavering. "This is a gross abuse of the captain's authority over a seating dispute. I have the entire incident recorded." He held up his phone. Wallace's eyes bulged. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He hadn't counted on his passenger being so composed, so articulate, so prepared. "That's an illegal recording," Wallace bellowed. "In my aircraft. That's a federal offense. It's a one-party consent state. Captain." Matteo shot back his knowledge as a well-read individual coming to the fore. "And your aircraft is currently on the ground in Illinois. The recording is perfectly legal." The standoff was reaching a boiling point. Passengers were now openly recording with their own phones, the cabin filling with a sea of small, glowing rectangles. The narrative was slipping from Wallace's control. He needed to reassert his dominance. He leaned in close, his voice, dropping to a menacing hiss, meant only for Matteo, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You think you're clever, don't you? Let me tell you who's waiting for you on that jet bridge. Not just airport cops. I've reported a level 2 threat. I've told them you were non-compliant and verbally aggressive towards my crew. That's a report that goes straight to the Department of Homeland Security. You're not just getting a talking to, son. You're getting arrested. You'll be on a no-fly list before you can even make your one phone call." It was a devastating threat designed to terrify and subdue. The mention of Homeland Security was the nuclear option. But Wallace had made a critical career-ending miscalculation. Unseen by the captain who was focused solely on his victim, 2 men in plain clothes had come up the jet bridge behind the police. They had been at the gate monitoring an unrelated international arrival when they heard the call about a pilot-identified security threat and decided to observe. They were calm, observant, and they wore the quiet, unmistakable authority of federal agents. One of them, a sharp-eyed man of Asian descent, stepped forward. He flashed his credentials to Officer Miller. "Agent David Chen, DHS. What seems to be the problem here?" Wallace's head snapped around. His face, which had been a mask of triumphant rage, suddenly went pale. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had invoked the name of DHS as a boogeyman, a tool of intimidation. He never expected them to actually show up. Agent Wallace said, his voice suddenly straining to sound official and in charge. "Thank you for the prompt response. Captain Richard Wallace. This passenger," he gestured at Matteo, "has been a disruptive and non-compliant element for the entire flight. He threatened my flight attendant." Agent Chen's gaze shifted from Wallace to Matteo. He saw a large black man in a tailored suit sitting calmly, his hands in plain sight. Then he looked at the pilot, a red-faced, agitated man practically vibrating with aggression. The visual disconnect was immediate and stark. "He threatened your flight attendant," Agent Chen asked, his tone neutral. "What was the nature of the threat?" He was verbally abusive," Wallace stammered, realizing he had overplayed his hand. His tone was menacing. "Captain," Agent Chen said, his eyes unblinking, "you reported a level 2 threat. That implies a physical component. Was there any physical aggression?" "Well, no, but did he use any language that would suggest a threat to the safety of the aircraft or its passengers? His entire demeanor was a threat." Wallace insisted, his desperation growing. Agent Chen turned his full attention to Matteo. "Sir, I'm Agent Chen. Would you be willing to provide your side of the story?" "Absolutely, Agent," Matteo said, finally standing up. He was taller than Wallace, and his calm dignity seemed to diminish the furious pilot even further. "And I'd be happy to provide you with the full, unedited audio recording of my interactions with both the flight attendant and the captain since this began." He offered his phone. Agent Chen took it. The other agent, a quiet man named Peterson, subtly positioned himself between Wallace and Matteo. The Chicago police officers, sensing the jurisdictional shift, took a step back, now acting as support. The power dynamic on the aircraft had just been completely rewritten. Captain Richard Wallace stood frozen in the aisle of his airplane. He was no longer the king of this small, sky-faring castle. He was just a man who had made a very big, very public mistake. The authority he had weaponized had just been trumped by a much higher power, and the unraveling had only just begun. The sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of the airport's security substation felt a world away from the tense cabin of Flight 2127. The space was functional and impersonal, with grey walls, metal chairs, and the persistent hum of a computer server. Dr. Matteo Bennett sat on one side of a small table, a cup of water untouched before him. On the other side sat Agent David Chen, who had placed Mateo's phone between them. Agent Chen hadn't listened to the recording in front of everyone. Instead, he had de-escalated the situation with quiet efficiency. He had instructed the CPD officers to disperse the crowd on the jet bridge, allowed the other passengers to deplane, and then requested that Captain Wallace, Flight Attendant Clara, Flight Attendant Chloe and Dr. Bennett accompany him and his partner to the substation for individual statements. It was a move that stripped Wallace of his audience and his stage. "All right, Dr. Bennett." Chen began, his voice calm and professional. "I want you to walk me through everything from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." Mateo recounted the events with the precision of a surgeon describing a procedure. He spoke about the empty seat, his polite request, Clara's initial permission after takeoff, and Chloe's subsequent apologetic retraction of that permission. He detailed his immediate compliance and his attempt to return to his seat. Then he described the sudden, aggressive appearance of Captain Wallace. "He approached me as if I'd already committed a crime," Mateo explained. "He didn't ask what happened. He pronounced judgment. When I tried to calmly state the facts, he accused me of calling his flight attendant a liar and labeled me a security risk." Agent Chen listened intently, making occasional notes on a pad. His face was impassive, betraying no opinion, but his eyes were sharp and analytical. "And at what point did you begin recording?" "The moment he told me to sit back down, and that he would deal with me on the ground," Mateo said. His tone and the accusation were so disproportionate to the situation, I felt I needed to protect myself. "A wise decision," Chen murmured. He pressed a button on a small digital evidence recorder on the table. "With your permission, Dr. Bennett, I'm going to play the audio from your phone and record it for our official file." Mateo nodded. Chen connected a small cable, and the audio began to play into the silent room. First, there was only the low drone of the aircraft, then the clear, booming voice of Captain Wallace. "A security risk." Mateo's own calm, measured voice followed. "A security risk for a misunderstanding about a seat that I was already resolving. Captain, that is a serious and baseless accusation." And then Wallace's sneering reply. "It's my cockpit, my call. Sit back down in that seat and don't say another word. We'll deal with you when we land." The recording continued, capturing the 30 minutes of tense silence, followed by the captain's announcement about remaining seated. Then came the damning confrontation at the gate. The audio was crystal clear. Officer Miller's voice. "Captain has reported a disturbance, a security threat." Mateo's response. "Gross abuse of the captain's authority. I have the entire incident recorded." And finally the pilot's fatal misstep, his hissing, intimidating threat recorded with chilling fidelity. "I've reported a Level 2 threat. That's a report that goes straight to the Department of Homeland Security. You're not just getting a talking to, son. You're getting arrested. You'll be on a no-fly list." Agent Chen stopped the playback. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of Wallace's own words. Chen looked at Mateo, his professional mask slipping for just a second to reveal a glimmer of profound respect. "Dr. Bennett," he said slowly. "Thank you. This is unequivocal." While Chen was with Mateo, his partner, Agent Peterson, was interviewing the flight crew in separate rooms. Clara was first. She was indignant, doubling down on her story. The passenger was immediately hostile, she claimed, twisting her hands in her lap. He was demanding he raised his voice. I felt threatened. Captain Wallace was just backing up his crew, protecting us. But under Peterson's calm, persistent questioning, her story began to fray. She couldn't specify what threatening words Mateo had used. She couldn't explain why he would be hostile one moment, and then, according to her own report, sit silently for the rest of the flight. Her story was built on emotion, not fact. Next was Captain Wallace. He stormed into the interview room, radiating belligerent confidence, as if he were the one in charge. He treated Agent Peterson's questions as an inconvenience. "Look, it's simple," Wallace stated, leaning back in his chair. The man was non-compliant. "In this day and age, we don't take chances. My word as pilot in command is law on that aircraft. I made a judgment call to ensure the safety of my flight. End of story. This doctor, or whatever he is, needs to learn a lesson about respecting authority." So to be clear, Captain, Peterson said, his voice mild. "You perceived his actions regarding the seat change as a credible threat to the safety of the aircraft?" "Absolutely. An unwillingness to follow crew instruction is the first step towards something much worse. And that's why you felt it was necessary to tell him he was going to be arrested and placed on a no-fly list." Wallace's confidence wavered. "I was using the tools at my disposal to de-escalate the situation and ensure his compliance." By threatening him with federal consequences, Peterson pressed gently. "I was maintaining order," Wallace blustered. The final interview was with the junior flight attendant, Chloe. She was visibly nervous, her hands trembling as she sat down. She kept glancing at the door as if expecting Clara or Captain Wallace to appear. "Miss Thompson," Agent Chen said, taking over this interview himself. "We just want to know what you saw and heard." Chloe took a deep breath. She looked at the two federal agents' men who represented a level of authority far beyond that of her captain. She had a choice: protect her career by backing up her superiors or tell the truth. "The passenger," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "Dr. Bennett. He was a perfect gentleman." And then the whole truth came pouring out. She described how polite Mateo had been, how he had immediately and gracefully agreed to move back to his seat when she explained the policy. "There was no disruption," she said, gaining confidence with each word. "He wasn't angry, he wasn't aggressive. He was already standing up to go back when Clara and Captain Wallace came over. The captain, he came out looking for a fight. He escalated everything. What Clara said about Dr. Bennett being hostile, it wasn't true. It was the opposite of true." She looked Agent Chen in the eye. "I was afraid to say anything. Captain Wallace, he has a reputation. But what he did was wrong. It was a complete abuse of his power." Agent Chen and Agent Peterson regrouped in a small office. They had 4 statements. 2 of them, Wallace's and Clara's, were a narrative of aggression and righteous authority. The other 2, Mateo's and Chloe's, were a perfectly aligned story of a calm, polite passenger being victimized by a power-tripping pilot and his loyal subordinate. And then they had the tiebreaker, the unimpeachable witness, the audio recording. Agent Chen looked at his partner. "The captain didn't just misuse his authority," he said, his voice tight with anger. "He weaponized the name of our department to intimidate a private citizen. He lied on a federal report. This isn't a customer service issue for the airline to handle. This is now a federal matter." The investigation had begun as a simple inquiry into an airport disturbance. It had now morphed into something far more serious. Captain Wallace, who had so arrogantly invoked the power of Homeland Security, was about to discover what it felt like to be on the receiving end of its full methodical attention. The news traveled up the Summit Air corporate ladder with the speed of a lit fuse. A pilot in command being formally investigated by the Department of Homeland Security for misuse of authority was not a minor incident. It was a 5-alarm fire. The airline's first move was classic damage control. Before Dr. Bennett had even left the airport, a chirpy, overly apologetic customer service manager intercepted him. "Dr. Bennett, on behalf of Summit Air, I am so terribly sorry for the misunderstanding on your flight today." The manager, a man named Jeffrey, gushed. "We pride ourselves on customer satisfaction, and clearly we fell short. To make it up to you, we'd like to offer you a $500 travel voucher and upgrade your status to our Platinum Elite tier for the next 2 years." Matteo looked at the man at his insincere eyes and practiced smile, and felt a profound sense of insult. They thought this was about a voucher. They thought his dignity and his rights could be bought for a few free flights. "Jeffrey," Matteo said, his voice low and cold, "your pilot, in his official capacity, falsely accused me of being a security threat. He called in law enforcement and threatened me with arrest and placement on a federal no-fly list. You seem to be under the impression that this is a misunderstanding. It is not. It is a matter for which I will be seeking legal counsel. You can keep your voucher." He turned and walked away, leaving the manager sputtering. By the next morning, Matteo was sitting in the polished mahogany office of Maria Flores, one of Chicago's most formidable civil rights attorneys. Maria was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with a reputation for taking on powerful corporations and winning. Matteo played the audio recording for her. She listened with an unnerving stillness, her expression hardening with every word from Captain Wallace's mouth. When it was over, she simply said, "They are in a world of trouble." She explained the legal landscape. They could sue Summit Air for defamation, false imprisonment for the time he was held on the plane, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The racial component, while harder to prove definitively in court, provided a powerful context that a jury would find compelling. "But this is bigger than just a lawsuit, Matteo." Maria said, her eyes alight with strategic fire. "The key here is the federal investigation. DHS doesn't take kindly to people crying wolf, especially not pilots. And that brings the Federal Aviation Administration into play." Meanwhile, Captain Rick Wallace was at his home in a leafy suburb of Chicago, trying to explain the situation to his wife, Cynthia. He framed it as a story of heroism. "I had to take control, Cyn," he said, pacing his spacious kitchen. "This guy, a real agitator, was challenging my crew's authority. I had to make an example of him. Now, because he's some hotshot doctor, the feds are doing their due diligence. It's a joke. My record is spotless. 30 years in the cockpit. 30 years they'll clear me in a week." Cynthia, a woman long accustomed to her husband's bluster, just nodded. "Well, just be careful, Rick. People are so sensitive these days." His spotless record was, in fact, not so spotless. An internal review at Summit Air, triggered by the DHS flag, began unearthing a pattern. Over the years, there had been a dozen informal passenger complaints filed against Captain Wallace. They all told a similar story. He was arrogant, dismissive, and had a quick temper, especially in situations where his authority was questioned. 3 of those complaints had been filed by black men. The airline's legal team saw the writing on the wall. A highly respected black surgeon with a perfect audio recording of their senior pilot making terroristic threats versus a pilot with a history of complaints and a story full of holes. This was not a case they could win in the court of public opinion, let alone a court of law. Summit Air's lawyers sent a letter to Maria Flores. They offered a confidential settlement, a significant one. 5 figures. Maria laughed when she read it. She called their lead counsel. "Are you serious?" she said into the phone. "Your pilot used the specter of terrorism to intimidate my client over a seat assignment. This isn't about money. This is about accountability. We are not signing a non-disclosure agreement. We are not quietly taking a check. We want 2 things: a public apology from your CEO and confirmation that you have terminated Captain Wallace's employment." The airline's lawyer balked. Terminating a pilot with his seniority is a complex process. Then I suggest you get started, Maria said, and hung up. The pressure was mounting on Wallace, but he remained oblivious, cocooned in his own self-righteousness. He received a formal notice from the FAA, summoning him to a preliminary hearing. He scoffed at it. A formality, he told his wife. They just need to hear my side of the story from the pilot in command. They'll see I was just following protocol. What he didn't know was that Agent Chen's report from Homeland Security had already been shared with the FAA. It was a meticulous, damning document. It highlighted the discrepancy between the statements, the corroboration of Chloe's testimony with the audio evidence, and concluded with a scathing assessment. Captain Wallace did not act to mitigate a security threat. He manufactured one. He used his authority not to ensure safety, but to intimidate and punish a passenger who had bruised his ego. His actions represent a serious lapse in judgment and a temperament ill-suited for the responsibilities of a pilot in command. The corporate spin from Summit Air was failing. The legal steel of Maria Flores was unbending, and the federal bureaucracy, slow but inexorable, was grinding forward. The walls which Rick Wallace believed were a fortress built on his seniority and authority were beginning to close in, and he didn't even hear the sound of the stones scraping into place. The headquarters of the FAA's Great Lakes region is an unassuming office building, a place of beige carpets and bureaucratic quiet. It is, however, one of the most powerful places in the aviation world, a place where careers that are forged in the sky can be ended with the stroke of a pen on the ground. Captain Richard Wallace walked into his hearing with a swagger. He wore his uniform crisp and adorned with the 4 stripes that denoted his command as if it were a suit of armor. He believed he was walking into a meeting of peers men who understood the pressures of the cockpit and the need for absolute authority. He was mistaken. Across the table sat 3 individuals. The man in the center was Mr. Robert Peterson, a veteran FAA investigator with a reputation for being as unflappable as he was thorough. He had a quiet demeanor that often led people to underestimate him. Beside him were a legal counsel for the FAA and an aviation safety expert. "Captain Wallace, thank you for coming in." Peterson began, his voice flat. "We have reviewed the incident report from Summit Air, the formal report from the Department of Homeland Security, and we have listened to the audio evidence provided by Dr. Bennett. We just have a few questions for you." Wallace launched into his prepared narrative, painting himself as the calm, decisive leader in a volatile situation. He described Dr. Bennett as agitated and unpredictable, and Clara as a shaken crew member in need of his protection. Peterson let him talk, his hands steepled on the table. When Wallace finished his monologue, Peterson leaned forward slightly. "Captain, the audio recording doesn't seem to support your description of Dr. Bennett as agitated. In fact, his voice is remarkably calm and steady throughout. Yours, however, is audibly raised and at several points aggressive. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Wallace felt a jolt of irritation. You can't judge a situation by a recording. You had to be there. The tension, his body language. He was a big guy. He was intimidating. The aviation safety expert chimed in. "Captain, the core responsibility of a pilot in command, under FAR 91.3, is the safety of the flight. The DHS report concludes that you escalated a minor customer service issue into a security confrontation. How did threatening a passenger with arrest and a no-fly list contribute to the safety of the flight? I needed to ensure his compliance for the remainder of the flight." Wallace shot back, his voice rising. "I needed him to know there were consequences." "Consequences for what exactly?" The FAA legal counsel asked, her tone sharp. "For attempting to move to an empty seat with permission from one flight attendant and then immediately agreeing to move back when told it was a mistake by another, where in that sequence of events did a violation occur that warranted threats of federal prosecution. Wallace was flustered. They weren't seeing it his way. They were taking the passenger's side. He challenged my crew. He challenged my authority. The cockpit's authority must be absolute. Mr. Peterson sighed softly. Captain authority is not the same as autocracy. It comes with the responsibility of sound judgment. And that is what is in question here, your judgment. He slid a file across the table. This is the official sworn testimony of Junior Flight Attendant Chloe Thompson. In it, she states, and I quote, "Dr. Bennett was a perfect gentleman. Captain Wallace came out looking for a fight. He escalated everything." She corroborates Dr. Bennett's version of events in every single detail. Are you suggesting that both a passenger and a member of your own crew are lying? Wallace stared at the file as if it were a snake. Chloe, the quiet one, the mousy little attendant he'd barely ever noticed. She had betrayed him. The foundation of his story, his heroic defense of his crew, crumbled into dust. She's young, he stammered. Inexperienced. She was probably scared she misread the situation. Or perhaps Captain... Peterson said, his voice now laced with ice. She was the only one besides Dr. Bennett who was telling the truth. The questioning continued for another hour, but it was a formality. Wallace's bluster faded, replaced by a sullen, defensive anger. He contradicted himself. His timeline became muddled, and his justifications grew increasingly thin. He was no longer a commander in his element. He was a defendant, watching his case fall apart. Finally, Mr. Peterson gathered his papers. Captain Wallace, you have demonstrated a profound lack of situational awareness and emotional control. You initiated a confrontation without cause. You made false statements to law enforcement, and you used your position as pilot in command to issue threats related to federal security protocols for personal, not professional reasons. You didn't just endanger the sense of well-being of a passenger, you compromised the very integrity of the command authority you claim to cherish. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the silent room. Effective immediately, your airline transport pilot license is placed on emergency suspension, pending a formal revocation hearing. You are not to act as pilot in command of any aircraft. A car will be waiting to take you home. You'll be formally notified of the revocation proceedings. The words hit Rick Wallace like a physical blow. Emergency suspension. Revocation. It was a death sentence for a pilot. His entire identity, his 30 years of seniority, his place at the top of the hierarchy, it was all gone. He looked at the three impassive faces across the table. They weren't his peers. They were his judges, and they had found him guilty. The armor of his uniform suddenly felt like a cheap costume. He stood up, his legs unsteady. The swagger was gone, replaced by a stooped, defeated posture. As he walked out of the room, he wasn't Captain Wallace anymore. He was just Rick, a man who had flown too close to the sun on wings of his own ego and had just come crashing down to Earth. The true fallout was just beginning. The official letter from the FAA arrived a week later. It was a cold, bureaucratic document, but its message was a thunderclap. His ATP license was not just suspended, it was formally revoked. The reasons cited were a laundry list of his professional sins: reckless behavior endangering passengers, misrepresentation of a security threat, gross abuse of the authority of a pilot in command, and conduct unbecoming of an airman. For Rick Wallace, it was like his own obituary had been delivered to his mailbox. Being a pilot wasn't what he did, it was who he was. The respect, the authority, the view from 35,000 feet, it was all he had ever wanted. Now it was gone forever. Summit Air, facing a massive lawsuit and a PR nightmare, terminated his employment the same day. There was no golden parachute, no fond farewell. His contract had a morality clause, and his actions had voided it completely. His 30 years of service were erased with a single brutal email from Human Resources. The story, which Maria Flores had strategically kept under wraps, finally broke. A local Chicago investigative reporter got a tip about the FAA revocation. Maria gave him an on-the-record interview, and she provided the audio. The news report went viral. The headline was devastating. "Arrogant pilot loses license after threatening black surgeon on flight." The audio clip of Wallace's menacing hiss, "You're getting arrested. You'll be on a no-fly list," played on national news networks. His face, a still frame from a passenger's video, was plastered everywhere. He became an overnight symbol of white privilege and abuse of power. The internet comment sections were a merciless torrent of scorn and ridicule. At home, the atmosphere turned toxic. His wife Cynthia, who had once admired his command and authority, now saw him as a disgrace. Their comfortable life was built on his 6-figure salary, a salary that had vanished. "How could you be so stupid, Rick?" she screamed at him during one of their many escalating fights. "Over a seat, you threw away our entire life over a stupid airplane seat." "You don't understand." He would roar back. "It was about respect, my authority." "Your authority got you fired," she retorted. "Your authority is going to get us foreclosed on." He tried to find other work in aviation. He thought with his experience, he could easily become a flight instructor or a pilot for a smaller charter company. But his FAA record was a permanent black mark. The revocation was public information. No one would hire a pilot who had his license revoked for reckless behavior and abusing passengers. He was radioactive. Within 6 months, the financial strain became unbearable. They had to sell their beautiful suburban home, the one with the big yard and the 3-car garage, and move into a small, cramped apartment. The tension was too much for Cynthia. One day, Rick came home to find a note on the counter and her closets empty. She had left him. Rick was adrift. His friends, mostly other pilots from Summit Air, stopped calling. They didn't want to be associated with him. He was a pariah in the world that had once defined him. He started drinking heavily, spending his days stewing in a bitter cocktail of rage and self-pity. It was never his fault. It was the doctor's fault for being arrogant, the flight attendant's fault for betraying him, the FAA's fault for being too politically correct. He eventually found a job, a humiliating come-down from his former glory. He became a dispatcher for a regional trucking company, working the graveyard shift in a dingy office that smelled of burnt coffee and desperation. Instead of commanding a multi-million-dollar jet from the sky, he was now a disembodied voice on a radio telling truckers where to find their next load of lumber or produce. Captain Richard Wallace, who once held the lives of hundreds in his hands, was now a glorified secretary for men he considered his inferiors. The fall was not a sudden dramatic crash. It was a long, grinding descent into mediocrity and irrelevance. Every morning, as he drove home from his shift in his beat-up sedan, the sun would just be rising, often glinting off the silver wings of airplanes beginning their ascent from O'Hare. He would watch them climb, a bitter ache in his chest, a ghost of a man haunted by the sky he could no longer touch. He had lost his wings, his career, his wife, and his home, all for a moment of unchecked ego, a flash of prejudice in a narrow metal tube high above the earth. 2 years passed. For Dr. Matteo Bennett, life had moved on, but it had also changed. He and Maria Flores had won a substantial settlement from Summit Air. The airline had also issued a public apology and implemented mandatory de-escalation and implicit bias training for all its flight crews, a program designed with input from a consulting firm Matteo had recommended. But Matteo didn't just pocket the money. He used a significant portion of it to establish the Bennett Foundation for Travelers' Rights, a non-profit dedicated to providing legal aid and advocacy for individuals who have been victims of discrimination or abuse of authority while traveling. The foundation quickly gained national recognition, becoming a powerful voice for accountability in the travel industry. Matteo, in addition to his work as a surgeon, became a reluctant but effective public figure, speaking about the incident not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. One cold Tuesday evening, Rick Wallace was sitting in his lonely, sparsely furnished apartment, nursing a cheap beer and flipping through channels on his small television. He stopped on a local news channel doing a feature story. His breath caught in his throat. There on the screen was Dr. Matteo Bennett. He was standing at a podium at a charity gala, looking distinguished and confident in a sharp tuxedo. The banner behind him read, Bennett Foundation for Travelers' Rights, Second Annual Gala. The reporter's voiceover explained the foundation's mission and its incredible success. Fueled by his own harrowing experience, the reporter said, Dr. Bennett has turned a moment of personal injustice into a national movement for passenger rights, helping hundreds of people fight back against discrimination. The camera zoomed in on Matteo's face as he spoke. Power without accountability is tyranny. Matteo said, his voice calm and resonant. Whether that power is held by a government, a corporation, or a single person in a position of trust, our goal is to ensure that every traveler is treated with dignity and that those who abuse their authority are held responsible for their actions. Rick stared at the screen, the beer bottle frozen halfway to his lips. He saw the respect in the eyes of the people surrounding Bennett. He saw the purpose and strength in Bennett's posture. He saw a man who had taken the ugliest moment of his life and forged it into something positive, something that helped others. And then Rick looked around his own small, dingy apartment. He saw the pile of bills on his table, the peeling paint on the walls, the empty space where his wife's picture used to be. He felt the familiar, dull ache of his meaningless job, the exhaustion of his lonely existence. In that moment, the final, brutal invoice of his actions was delivered. Karma hadn't just been about losing his job or his house. That was just the beginning. The true karma, the hardest karma, was this his act of petty tyranny intended to humiliate and diminish. One man had instead elevated that man to a position of national prominence and respect. Matteo Bennett had become a force for good, and Rick Wallace, the once mighty captain, had been utterly and completely erased. He had become a footnote in another man's success story. His legacy was not 30 years of flying. It was a single viral audio clip, a cautionary tale told to new pilots in training seminars. He had tried to put Dr. Bennett in his place, and in doing so he had lost his own. He turned off the television, but he couldn't turn off the image of Dr. Bennett at the podium. The screen went black, but all Rick could see was his own reflection, a bitter, broken man forever grounded by the weight of his own arrogance. The silence of the apartment was his cockpit now, and it was a lonely, permanent descent. The story of Captain Wallace and Dr. Bennett serves as a powerful, real-world reminder that a uniform or a title doesn't grant you immunity from consequences. It shows how quickly a lifetime of achievement can be undone by a single act of prejudice and ego. Dr. Bennett's calm resolve and quick thinking, arming himself with a simple audio recording, became the key that unlocked a system of accountability that many feel is out of reach. In the end, it wasn't just a pilot who lost his license. It was a powerful statement that in the modern world, With technology in every hand, there are fewer places for injustice to hide. If this story of accountability and the dramatic turn of karma resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with others who need to hear it. These stories matter. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into real-life events where the truth ultimately comes to light. Thank you for listening.